The day after the death of Adolf Hitler, the Third Reich collapsed. Within weeks, Allied troops took possession of Germany, a country in ruins. Munich and the surrounding areas were taken over by American troops. On May 3, 1945, the 3rd United States Army took possession of the town of Steinhöring in Bavaria. They discovered a large house with almost 200 children living in it. They found newborn babies, their mothers, nurses, and young pregnant women. They had been abandoned. They were traumatized.
I can remember it well. It was like a storm, with thunder and lightning. I can picture myself at the front of a crowd of women that were gathered together. Men wearing black uniforms were stood against the wall. We were only young. We were children. When I first started my research, I went to Steinhöring and realized that it was a place in my memory. It's the only memory that I have. How did that affect us? I don't know.
The children that had been discovered by the Allies were one of the hidden secrets of the Nazi regime. They were conceived by the Reich for the Reich. They were the product of a disturbing mission that had been started 10 years earlier, the Lebensborn. The intention was that these infants would be the successors for a new Germany that had been designed by Himmler, Goebbels, and other SS dignitaries. Today, aged 70, in spite of themselves, they are the last descendants of the National Socialist regime.
The perfect children that were born in the Nazi birthhouses, according to Nazi ideology, were supposed to go on to dominate the world. I didn't cope very well at all.
It was the other side of Holocaust. If you kill underrace, then you have to produce, on the other hand, those who were said to be better persons just by their looks of being tall, blonde, and blue-eyed.
Most of the Lebensborn children only discovered the true story behind their birth in recent years.
My mother didn't say anything about it. She never spoke about my birth. She told me about it for the first time a few weeks ago. It took more than 70 years for my mother to feel ready to tell me what had really happened.
Between 1935 and the end of the war, more than 20,000 babies were born in the Nazi birth houses. These children, now adults, reveal their search to learn the truth about their birth and their quest to trace their parents.
Da muss der deutsche Junge der Zukunft lang und rank sein, flink wie Windhunde, zäh wie Leder und hart wie Kruppstahl.
In 1933, the newly elected Adolf Hitler introduced a series of racist laws in Germany. People suffering from hereditary diseases were forcibly sterilized. The law to protect German blood prohibited marriage between Jews and German citizens. He instructed his second-in-command, Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, to put the finishing touches to an unprecedented eugenics program. The concept was as simple as it was Machiavellian. The mission was to recruit parents who would procreate and produce a generation of pure Aryans. The members of the National Socialist Party were ordered to produce at least 4 children with their wives. Otherwise, their evolution in the hierarchy would be disadvantaged. They were given a second and more confidential order: to produce as many children as possible out of wedlock. Helga Kachau was the product of one of these extramarital relationships. She was born on March 23, 1941.
Gezeugt wurde ich 9 Monate vorher.
I was conceived 9 months earlier, on the day that Germany celebrated victory over France. Ministry officials were rewarded with special leave for the occasion. My mother went to the island of Usedom, a meeting place for the Nazi elite. That's where she met my father for the first time. He had made the trip from Berlin that day. I was an illegitimate child. I was born out of wedlock. At the time, the best thing that a woman in my mother's situation could do was to go to Lebensborn's house to give birth.
Helga Kachau's mother gave birth in Steinhöring, the main birth house in the Lebensborn program. It was a place where pregnant, single women could give birth without being judged by their loved ones. Only a few women went there in the first year. The regime kept the project top secret. There wasn't any propaganda, and they didn't make any public announcements. On the contrary, the only video footage that exists is amateur. From 1938 onwards, birth houses were opened elsewhere. They were opened in annexed Austria, where the physical appearance of the women corresponded to the principles of the Ministry of Race. Brigitte Rambeck was born in a Lebensborn in Pernitz.
All Aryans were welcome, but they had to prove their Aryan identity. My parents didn't have any problems doing this because my father was a lawyer in the National Socialist Party. They were accepted into the program without any problems. Their situation was typical at the time. This is why the Lebensborn homes were set up. They gave Aryan men and women of good origin the opportunity to give birth in secret.
Der Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler trifft in Den Haag ein, wo von Anton.
In 1938, Heinrich Himmler declared, "The newborn children will add to the number of people fighting for Germany and take away from the other side. I intend to search for and obtain German blood from all over the world." Race was the cornerstone of the system. It was in the name of race that the Third Reich plunged Europe into war in 1939. Poland, Belgium, Holland, the German troops charged through Europe. One nation, more than any other, caught the attention of Heinrich Himmler. On the 10th of June, 1940, Norway surrendered. The Reichsführer ordered the opening of 10 birth houses. Oslo and its surrounding area became a place of leave for the German soldiers. This was not a random choice. The intention was that the soldiers would come into contact with Norwegian women and procreate.
Himmler wanted to create a purebred race, a pure Aryan race. Norway was the country of his dreams. The Norwegians were known to be descendants of the Vikings, and the blonde woman had typically Aryan traits. This meant that Norway was the perfect place for the Lebensborn program.
Thorleif Blatt was born in a Lebensborn house in the outskirts of Oslo. According to her son, his mother had no alternative at the time.
She was in a difficult situation. It wasn't easy. They were judged by people and accused as being whores for the Germans. They were ostracized because they had made the mistake of sleeping with the enemy.
Between 1942 and 1945, 10,000 children were born in Norway, the largest contingent of the Lebensborn children. The majority of them went to live in Germany. Birth houses were also opened in Holland, Sweden, and Denmark. But this wasn't enough for Heinrich Himmler. As far as he was concerned, there weren't enough children being born, and they didn't have birth houses in enough countries. Maternity houses were opened in France and Belgium, where the populations had up until then been considered impure. At the start of 1943, the black SS flag flew in the courtyard of the WWII castle. Belgian women that were considered to have childbearing potential for the Reich were taken to the Liège Lebensborn. Gisèle Nyango was born in WWII. She doesn't know anything else about her birth. She has spent 70 years trying to understand why her mother gave birth in a Lebensborn.
According to my French identity documents, I was born in Bar-le-Duc on October 11th, 1943. My mother was extremely poor. She had nothing. It's possible that she was asked to leave me in a Lebensborn because I would add to the number of children that lived there. Maybe. She probably thought that this meant that I'd be looked after. I'm not sure, but it's a possible explanation. It seems likely given how poor she was. When I was looking through her paperwork, I saw that she was entitled to 1 free meal a day when she was 6 months pregnant. So maybe she didn't have any other option. I don't know.
Other than this, Gisèle doesn't have any other information about the mother she never knew. She will never know if her mother gave birth in Lebensborn because she wanted to provide a child for the Reich, or if she was forced to abandon her daughter due to poverty. In 1943, the whole of Europe was under strict rationing. However, the people in the Lebensborn project had everything they needed. Heinrich Himmler made sure of it. A safe haven, where the nurses wore swastikas. Gisela Heidenreich's mother was one of the program leaders. Over the years, she has given her daughter rare insights into her time there.
They say it was the best time of their life. They had very good food, they had excellent food, and they were laughing, and they were singing, and they were dancing, and they could knit, they had all those embroideries, and they had a very good time. And you can imagine during wartime, many of the women, they came out of some destroyed cities and everybody was poor. And so they were for at least 3 or 4, some were even 5 to 6 months they could stay there. It was kind of little paradises.
It was wartime, yet the Lebensborn homes had highly qualified staff, leading midwives and doctors. My mother always said it was the best place for a woman to go to give birth. She always spoke about it in a very positive way.
However, the paradise described by Brigitte Rambeck's mother came at a price. The Nazi leaders considered children that were born with a disability useless and even dangerous. They thought that they would contaminate the Aryan race.
They were sent to hospitals and they were killed. Euthanasie. These were victims of euthanasie. Children had to be perfect, of course. And if there was somebody who was not okay, they were sent to special, what they say, special treatment. special treatment was killing. Yeah. And so we don't know how many were killed, because this, of course, was much more secret than anything else.
The Lebensborn, a real-world matrix conceived by the Third Reich, had no need or desire for these babies. Mothers were informed of the untimely death of their babies and were given no other information. For other children, destiny had something else in store. A month after birth, they were baptized according to Nazi rites. This initiation concerned doctrine rather than religion. A ceremony was held during which children were admitted into the National Socialist regime.
Also im März wurde ich dort geboren und
I was born in a Lebensborn in March, and a month later, on April the 20th, Adolf Hitler's birthday, at the time a national holiday, I was admitted into the SS community.
The babies were presented, and SS-man in the uniform, he touched the baby with the dagger, with the SS dagger, not with a like a cross. So now we accept you as a member of our society. And this meant that they really somehow really took those little babies with the rituals and put them into their sinister society.
Godfathers were usually named during the ceremony. I don't know much about it, but I do know people who had Göring and Goebbels for their godfathers. It was a substitute for a Christian baptism.
I didn't know anything else. It was life as I knew it. I was born surrounded by the SS flags. I saw only men in uniform. For me, it was normal. I spent time in a large SS barracks at Pulag, and the men in their black SS uniforms were all very caring towards me. It was as if they were my kind, caring uncles.
When leaving a Lebensborn birth house, mothers were faced with a final and irrevocable choice. The authorities advised the parents to leave their children with them. They promised to erase all traces of the biological parents and find a new family for the babies. An SS family, of course, to strengthen the new Germanic race.
At the age of 5 months, I was assigned to a foster family, the Schneider family. I spent my first 4 years in Pulag, in a complex designed by Martin Bormann that served as the Führer's headquarters. I learned this much later on, but I spent my first 4 years in the foster family's home.
She brought me to Bad Tölz, to her sister who was living there, and she brought me there as a also Norwegian foster child. She did not tell that I was her real child, because her and her sister, she had 2 sons already, and she always, like they told me later, wanted a little girl, so she brought kind of little gift coming back from Norway, a little girl, poor little Norwegian foster child.
The idea of abandoning a child didn't seem to pose a problem for Nazi converts such as the mothers of Helga Kachau and Gisela Heidenreich. What was it like in the occupied countries? The mothers weren't always aware of the true purpose of a Lebensborn birth house. During the occupation, almost 50,000 children were born each year following relationships with German soldiers. In April 1942, the regime set about obtaining the Germanizable children. Heinrich Himmler, the Reich Commissioner for Strengthening of German Nationhood, stated, "It is my opinion that some of these children are suitable and that the Lebensborn should take immediate action to put them in our care." A few months later, the SS authorities opened the Westwald, a Lebensborn in a forest north of Paris, in a castle that had been requisitioned by the German troops. It welcomed women who corresponded to the Nazi criteria. Erwin Grinsky was born there. He discovered this in 2009 when his mother died.
My mother was a translator and worked as an interpreter for the German army. That's how she met my father. She was not aware that she'd given birth in a Lebensborn. She thought that it was a French maternity clinic. She told me that my father asked her to leave me in the home. But she refused. She kept quiet and left for Germany. My father received his commission in July 44 when I was 2 months old. We left for Germany.
Erwin Grinsky went with his mother to Dortmund in Germany. When she got there, she discovered that the father of her child was already married. She found herself alone. This is the price that she paid for Erwin to escape Germanization.
I feel more like a love child than a Lebensborn child.
In 1944, the Allies started to close in. This marked a turning point in the war. The Allied troops landed in Normandy. The Lebensborn in France, Belgium, and Norway were caught up in the battles. SS troops were ordered to repatriate newborns to Munich. Gisella's mother was in charge of the repatriation. On the 10th of August 1944, she participated in the closure of the French Lebensborn in La Morlaix.
She was sent by her office from Munich to close this home. And she said, she and a nurse, two of them, they took about, I said, it was 8 or 10 children. And she brought the children to Wiesbaden, one of them, a part of to Wiesbaden, and some of them she brought back to Steinhöring, where she worked in meanwhile also.
The directors of the Belgian Lebensborn in Wegimont started to panic. The children were immediately evacuated. The German border was only 300 kilometers away, but time was running out. The US military were approaching. Walter Boser was not yet 1 year old. He lived in the maternity house with his mother. His life took a different turn on the day that he left the Lebensborn.
My mother and I were removed in September 44. The Germans were leaving Belgium because the Allies were advancing. We went by truck to Aix-la-Chapelle. I don't know what happened to her after that. I don't know why she wasn't put in the same truck as me. The children and then the staff had been put in the truck. She ran behind the truck shouting that I was her child. They didn't care. My journey happened in stages. I was taken to Aix-la-Chapelle, then to Steinhöring, and then we were transported to a convent next to Dachau.
It took 8 months for the German troops to repatriate Walter and the other residents of the Lebensborn to the capital of Bavaria. The Nazi regime had fallen, but the SS officials wanted to keep the children at all costs. 300 of them were found in cramped conditions in the Bavarian headquarters of the organization. On the 3rd of May 1945, the GIs took possession of Steinhöring. They discovered the birth house and the children who had been conditioned to hate them.
Da kamen dann die Amerikaner. Und da ist mir aufgefallen, dass
The Americans arrived, and that's when I realized that I considered the US as the enemy.
identifizierte. Aber die Amerikaner waren sehr nett.
The soldiers were very kind to the children in the home.
Und haben ihnen Geschenke gebracht. Und ich fand das
They bought us gifts,
obszön.
but I felt as if it was wrong.
Einmal
I was suddenly supposed to like the American soldiers.
sollte. Aber als Kind
I was a child
die ersten 4
and had
Jahre
spent the
seines
first 4 years of my life being educated in Nazi ideology.
erzogen worden.
It was complicated.
Einmal 45 war alles ganz anders.
Suddenly,
Das hat
in 1945, everything changed.
Irritationen
I was deeply troubled by the upheaval.
gelöst.
The fall of the last Lebensborn signaled the beginning of the end of the eugenics program that had started 10 years earlier. Germany was in ruins. A question had to be answered. What should be done with these children? They were handed over to the Red Cross and to the United Nations, and then placed in a convent alongside orphans from concentration camps. 15 of these children were French. Walter and the young Giselle were amongst them.
It was run by nuns. It was a former nunnery. They set up the home for the children who came from the surrounding camps. Some Jews came, some alone and by foot, to this home. There were around 100 small children. I don't know how many exactly. We were housed in a wing of the building. Older children came here to reconstruct themselves.
It is somewhat paradoxical that the teenagers who had been released from concentration camps looked after Giselle and the other young children. The journey of the residents of the Lebensborn didn't come to an end at the Indersdorf convent. In fact, it was just a beginning. The Nazis had destroyed almost all of their birth records, and the documents held by the French were very fragmented.
The children were sent to all of the countries that had been allies during the war that had adoption policies in place. It was decided by language. We spoke French, we spoke German, we spoke many different languages. Even the children that had been born in occupied countries like Poland spoke the native language. That's how I ended up in France.
In 1946, the leadership of the French Settlement and Family Services took these children from the United Nations. France needed them to rebuild the population. They were mostly repatriated in the east of France. Many of them were ill when they arrived. Walter Bosser had an eye injury and was hospitalized for several months.
We arrived at the Commercy Hospital in the center of Meuse. We were given to the social aid services. We were put in orphanages. We were given welfare contributions. We were placed in families with wet nurses. They weren't called foster families at that time.
The social aid services erased the birth records, as was standard at that time for wards of the state. In doing so, France thought that they had erased their past as Lebensborn children, children of shame. In Germany, things happened differently. The parents were identifiable. Lots of them came to take back the children that they had given to the Führer. This was when Gisela Heidenreich discovered that the family in which she lived was not her real family. She discovered this on the day that the man she believed to be her father was released from jail.
One day they said, Papa is coming home. Oh, yes, I was happy too. Somebody came, a man, and the boys ran for him, and and said, "Papa, Papa," and of course I said also, "Papa, Papa." And this, I remember this scene, this is the first shock in my whole life. I still see this man refusing me and saying, "What are you doing here?" And to his wife, "Why did you bring this SS bastard in?" So this was a real shock. And of course I asked, what does he mean and why is he not my father? So of course they said, "You have no idea, that you can't understand, and he doesn't mean it, and it's not so bad." It was like, yeah, I was fallen out of my identity. I think it was the beginning of a real big crisis in this little girl who did not no more know who I am.
Gisela then found her birth mother. They had to learn to live together in a country in ruins. At the same time, children in Norway were discovering, rather cruelly, that they are not like the other children. In a country traumatized by 5 years of occupation, the Lebensborn babies symbolized the collaboration with the enemy of thousands of Norwegians. Thorleif had followed his mother to Germany during the war and returned to Norway after the liberation.
When we returned to Oslo, I could only speak German. But when we traveled from the center of Oslo to my mother's house, I wasn't allowed to speak. We didn't want anyone to discover that I was German. So the first month that I was there, I was not allowed to speak.
In 1954, when Thorleif Blatt was 12 years old, the story behind his birth caught up with him again.
My mother wanted to marry a Norwegian man. But I was a problem, an obstacle. I was complicating things. The man that she wanted to marry did not want me to be part of the marriage. His mother held a deep hatred for the Germans, and she said to him, "If you marry this woman, her little kraut must not be a part of the marriage." So my existence caused a problem for my mother. She decided to put me in an orphanage. She had to explain to the orphanage, in my presence, why she wanted to abandon me. I didn't come across this kind of problem in the orphanage because most of the children had the same background as me. A lot of us had a German father and a Norwegian mother. I don't know if it happened everywhere, but the hatred towards the Germans remained widespread for a long time after the war. To give you an example, in 1972, when I married the woman I loved, her father refused to come to the church because she was marrying a German.
However, many of the children suffered a fate worse than Thorleif. Some of the children that lived in Norway went through hell at the end of the war, just because they were born in a Lebensborn. Paul Hansen's father was a soldier in the German army. His Norwegian mother followed his father to Germany and left her son in a Nazi children's home.
My mother stayed there for a year, and she abandoned me in a Lebensborn. I didn't know where she'd gone. She'd met a German man. I learned later on that they both went to Germany.
From 1945 onwards, the Oslo authorities supported Paul Hansen and thousands of other children. Some of them were placed in psychiatric hospitals. Paul Hansen was 5 years old at the time.
When I arrived at the Emma Hjort Psychiatric Hospital, I found myself living with some very ill people. They would scream out at night. I asked myself, what am I going to do? We were officially declared retarded. A doctor came to the National Hospital and declared each and every one of us as retarded. We were declared mentally retarded because we had been born in a Lebensborn. I can't remember what happened next. But when we went for a walk in the city centre, people would laugh at us. Hey, it's the freaks from the Institute. They called us the Emma Hjort freaks.
50 years after the war, the Norwegian Lebensborn children took the state authorities to court for discrimination. The state granted them financial compensation, but refused to admit liability.
I don't know what happened to everyone. But during the time that I was president of the Association of Lebensborn Children of War, I heard many horror stories. It's difficult to comprehend the extent of the abuse that took place in the orphanages and the foster homes. The Norwegian authorities considered the little Krauts as inferior and as a possible future fifth column.
In France, no one feared the emergence of a fifth column since the children didn't know where they came from. A family in Nancy adopted Giselle Nyango when she arrived in France. She was brought up in a loving family with a caring mother, and she grew up without ever suspecting where she came from. But in 1954, 10 years after the war, she discovered her birth name by chance.
I started to feel different when I was 10 years old. Other children had started to call me names, and they said that I'd been adopted. It was a difficult time for me. I asked my parents if I'd been adopted. They said yes and gave me my birth file. I found out that my birth name was Magula. Then I forgot about it. I kept the file in a drawer. I looked at it from time to time to remind myself of my name, to remind me, but other than that, I hid it away.
Giselle Nyango didn't say anything else about it. She lived in a happy family, and her adoption wasn't part of it. Other children were not able to bury the past. It was too much in their present. After returning from Germany, Erwin Grinsky lived with his mother in an apartment in Avignon. His mother called him Hervé for 60 years as she feared that his Lebensborn birth would be unmasked if she called him by his real name. She was ashamed of the conditions surrounding his birth.
I was 16 at the time. I can remember it really well. I was applying for my identity card. My mother kept all of her documentation in a small iron chest. She took a document out of it and gave it to me. It had the name Erwin Schmidt written on it. I started to question things. Was I called Grinsky or was I called Schmidt? My mother told me that it was a secret and that nobody could find out. She tore the document up and threw it into the fire. This was the only time that I saw the name Schmidt on a birth certificate.
Schmidt was the name of his father, the German soldier who took his mother to give birth in Lebensborn in 1944.
Little by little, from time to time, she gave me snippets of information. She mentioned my father. But if I asked questions, she closed up immediately and changed the subject. But she always called me Hervé. She never called me Erwin.
The post-war fate of the Lebensborn children varied, but they all have one thing in common. They have lived for decades in denial, in secret. Walter Boser is an exception. He fought for 30 years to have access to his social aid file. His quest began the day that he met his future wife. He wanted to know who he was. He tracked down his mother, who was still alive at the time. She lived in Belgium, where she had rebuilt her life after the war.
How old were you at that time?
When did I meet my mother for the first time? I was 54 years old.
How did you feel?
How shall I put it? I don't want to be horrible. When I started researching my background, I couldn't understand how a mother or father wouldn't want to find their child. I judged them. I said that if I found them, I would ask them why they hadn't tried to find me. But it never works out that way. It was a joy and a disappointment. I was disappointed to find that she had become an old woman. I couldn't remember what she looked like. I couldn't remember having seen her. That's why I couldn't remember her face.
After years of speculating, Walter learned that he came from the Belgian Lebensborn in Vegemont. He wanted to know whether he was conceived out of love, or was he conceived for the Reich.
I made her explain what had happened. She said that she was young at the time. She was only 18. She worked there as an assistant cook. She wasn't even the cook. She was an assistant cook. She prepared the bottles for the babies. She said that she needed someone to look after me, so she took me to work with her. Apparently, this was allowed.
According to Walter's mother, he was taken by mistake with the Lebensborn children. Her explications didn't give him the answers to his questions.
I asked her what had happened to my father. She handed me a photograph. I didn't know what to say. It was a picture of me in my father's arms. He was crouching down and he had his legs around me to keep me upright.
This old photograph is all that he has of his father, a photograph of a German soldier with a child. He doesn't know anything else about him. His father died before he could find him.
He died in 1986. If the French authorities had helped me when I was 21, I might have known my father. But because of stupid bureaucratic procedures and the cruelty of the people involved, I missed out.
The children of the Nazi birth houses had to wait until 2008 to get the answers that they were looking for. This is the date that the Red Cross opened their archives, 60 years after the war, a veritable lifetime. Erwin finally got the answers that his mother had refused to give him. He was indeed born in the French Lebensborn in La Morlaix.
All that I can say is that it was very difficult to deal with. I spent 65 years of my life in the dark. This might be why I'm the way I am. I'm a pretty close person. It certainly had an effect on me. I spent many years not knowing where I was from.
Giselle Nyango also lived in ignorance for over 60 years. When her adoptive mother died, her husband pushed her to seek her origins. She only had her birth name to go on, but she managed to discover her birthplace. She revealed all to her children.
It was very difficult to talk about it. It's still very difficult even now. Why? I don't know. We're not responsible. We are the victims. But since the war, people have been prejudiced against the Lebensborn children. I was ashamed. It was difficult to learn that I was part of the project. It was difficult to accept.
She discovered that she had a brother living in Belgium. It's thanks to him that she found out more about her biological parents.
I contacted my younger brother, who was very welcoming towards me. He told me about our biological mother. I say biological because that's the way it is. He found a photograph of a German military in one of his mother's albums. But that's it. There's no name, nothing else.
Does this still affect you?
No, it's only now that I'm starting to digest. Or should I say accept my birth, and to understand that I am a victim in the situation.
Half a century after the war, the children, now adults, are left with more questions than they have answers. They still feel the pain and the resentment. Who were these men, their fathers, without whom their background would have been so different? Were they just soldiers, or were they part of the SS?
My mother had told me that my father was reported missing. After the war, this more or less meant that someone was dead. I did not ask any more questions about him. I must admit that I wasn't interested in looking for my father. But 6 months after the death of my mother, my father found me. It was like a bad movie, but it was my reality. My father had just turned 80. He obviously wanted someone to take care of him, and he had remembered that he'd had a daughter.
Helga Karau discovered that her father was a high-ranking member of the SS who had been well aware of the purpose of the Lebensborn and who would have known exactly what had happened to his daughter when she left the birth house.
I love my parents, and I have never wanted to take them to trial. Is this the cross that I bear? Yes. Even today it is difficult. Children with the same background as me will carry the weight of the legacy of National Socialism forever.
The residents of the Lebensborn were the orphans of history. They had never been recognized as victims of war. From the 10th of October 1947 to the 10th of March 1948, the 4 SS organizations that led the purification of the race program were investigated as part of the Nuremberg trials. The leaders of the Lebensborn program were in the dock. Colonel Max Solman, program director. By his side, Inge Vermetz, his assistant, and Gregor Ebner, the organization's medical officer. They were acquitted of charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity and were only charged with being members of the SS. Gisela Heidenreich's mother spent 11 months imprisoned in Nuremberg. She was a key witness in the trial.
Nobody ever could, in those times, prove their crimes, and there were a lot of crimes. It was a criminal institution, definitely it was. But all the time, she always said, I only did something very good. We only helped foster childs, and we owned children, and we only helped parents who couldn't get own children, and I would do this today again. This was a sentence I heard very often from her. And also the sentence, do you think that we would have come free in Nuremberg? And the Americans themselves said this was a model of a very excellent social institution. She kept repeating this sentence. Even Americans said it was a model of a social institution.
They were found not guilty in the eyes of history, and the 22,000 Lebensborn children have fallen into oblivion. All that remains is the shame that drives most of them to hide their past, even 70 years later. They are connected by their inner demons and their questions that remain unanswered. The Lebensborn children still carry this pain with them.